sorry for that. All right. Should I go back to the initial slide because nobody heard that? So I was talking about the CO2 concentration on this planet for the last 800,000 years, depicted in this graph. This data was assembled from ice cores where little bubbles are enclosed that you can analyze for their CO2 concentration, and through the different layers of ice you can go back in time and reconstruct atmospheric condition on this planet. And we can see that until about 1950 we never surpassed 300 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now we are shooting very far north of that baseline, currently 420, 425 ppm and continuously increasing, which is one of the major reasons for global warming. Now, when we look at the Earth system itself, this is in acknowledgement of one of our greatest climate advocates in Australia that recently has very sadly died, Professor Will Steffen from Canberra. He was an absolute outstanding researcher in the field of climate change, particularly on a global scale. This is a paper that he published in PNAS in 2018, and it shows you the Earth system pathways that, based on his knowledge and that of his colleagues, they trajected where we're heading. You may have heard the term climate cliff and that we're close to the cliff. Well, this depicts the cliff. You see the glacial or interglacial times in the very back, where you have cooler temperatures, warmer temperatures interchanging, and you travel through time where you have your interglacials that are warmer, then you have your glacial periods that are cooler, and Earth would have just bounced in this half pipe from one end to the other. Now, with the start of the Anthropocene, and particularly now the last 200, 250 years, we started to see a warming of the planet since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And with the increasing emissions produced by burning fossil fuels, we are now pushing the Earth system into a warmer state. And this warmer state means we're getting to what is indicated here, to a planetary threshold. This threshold means that once we surpass this threshold, there are certain processes within the system that we will be unable to reverse. If we want to avoid this pathway and get to what is named here a stabilized Earth, we need Earth stewardship. That means on a system scale, planetary system scale, Earth stewardship. Cities is part of that because cities are very large emitters of climate relevant greenhouse gases and also further accelerate warming of the Earth's surface. Professor Steffen also in this paper talks about tipping cascades. And this is something we need to understand when we talk about planet Earth and where we're heading. Once, like a domino game, once you start tipping one stone, there are chain reactions that are sometimes even accelerating the decline or the speed towards the next tipping point. This graphic shows you that these tipping points are temperature related. These temperatures that you see here in yellow, 1 to 3 degrees, in orange, 3 to 5, and then above 5 degrees, these are surface temperatures of the planet. So if we have a surface temperature warming here in Australia currently of about 1.5 degrees, we are getting very much into the areas of these yellow tipping points, of these cascades. And we can already see, when you look at Australia in the map, coral reefs were indicated 2018. In 2019 and 2020, we had mass bleaching in the coral reefs. 80% or even more than 80% are currently damaged or dead. And the United Nations or UNESCO from the United Nations is thinking of changing the World Heritage status of the reef because of that. So there are already signs that these tipping points are reached or even surpassed. We know that this year is the lowest measurement of Arctic ice and also of Antarctic ice shield. So there are definitely indicators out there that show us that the yellow tipping points may have already been reached. And you can see with the arrows reaching out to other tipping points, particularly the thermohaline circulation, which is the ocean circulation belt that goes all around the world with cold water, warm water, high salinity, low salinity mixing. There are effects from the melting waters of the Arctic shields and the Antarctic shields that influence how these ocean belts in circulation and therefore the climate that we experience are starting to change. These are global impacts from our activity. Now let's have a look at Australia and how Australia is doing to counter these very scary effects. Well, the data tells us we're not doing really well in Australia. I won't go through the list. You can read through the list here, but we are the last of 64 countries for national and international climate policy, and I guess that's also owed to the past 10 years under the previous government, that there was no real progress. Just look at the last point that I list here. This is from the Earth Overshoot Day. When all Australians would live a lifestyle like we currently do, we would need 4 planets Earth and their resources to actually sustain that kind of lifestyle. It also means that over time, the graph on your right-hand side shows you the carrying capacity, really, biocapacity of Australia. You can see that the ecological footprint didn't really change over the past 50, 60 years, but our biocapacity has declined in this country. We're depleting the resources that we have available. And that means that our ratio for the biocapacity reserve plus minus the deficit is getting worse. When we look at Sydney, scaling further down to Sydney, we can see that Sydney itself as a city is a very high CO2 emitter, and it also does produce relatively small amounts of renewables as well. Other things that Sydney is not really good at, we know that water recycling, for example, has a very low percentage in the water use across the city. There are other indicators that Sydney itself is not doing really well in this space to contribute positively to global effects from human activity. Now, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to leave the room depressed or on your screens to finish this seminar and think that doom and gloom is upon us. We at the university here at Western, we take this very seriously, and we really work for empowering the community. Part of the mission, it's basically in our constitution for the university, part of the mission of the university is to work in our research for the local communities. We're only one of 2 universities in Australia that have that written into their constitution. Because of this approach to community and to work with community and for community, we are very good for several years now in working towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Our Chancellor, Professor Barney Glover, has signed up to the SDGs very early. We were one of the very early universities that signed up to work towards the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And last year, as a result of all our collective efforts within teaching, research, within operations of the university, buildings, and so on, we reached the #1 status of 1,406 universities globally that were assessed for their contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals. We came out as #1. As a relatively young university, this is a fantastic result, which we are really, really proud of. Also, the university itself, as I said, in its operations, is doing a lot. We were carbon neutral last year, which was 3 years ahead of what we had strategically planned for. You can see in these images here, we have electric vehicle stations. Funnily enough, I come here on the weekend and I see strangers starting to juice up their Teslas on our charging stations. So the knowledge is out there that Western Sydney has these stations. We have a very comprehensive sustainability and resilience strategy in place. We also provide a lot of undergrad and postgraduate units that have sustainability at the core of the teaching, from business to engineering, us in planning, in health. We're all looking at how we can contribute in what we teach to our students to a greater understanding of what sustainability really means in all different aspects of our degree structure. Lastly, I want to say that not only do I feel proud being able to work on Darug land and having the permit or the permission to do my work on land that was never seeded, we have recently been awarded nearly $80 million to build the first indigenous center of excellence in Parramatta, on Parramatta South Campus, which is a fantastic outcome of our new or relatively new Deputy Vice Chancellor for Indigenous Leadership. It's one of the first leadership positions in the university administrative system in Australia that absolutely focuses laser sharp on Indigenous support. We have a lot of additional underlying support for our Indigenous students, including special lectures, the Bananami centers. We have lots of programs for children. The Pathways to Dreaming or the Heartbeat program are only a few examples. So we're really taking it very seriously to be there for the community and also look at the largest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population here in Western Sydney for all of Australia. This is where most of the Aboriginal people still live today. And we are, taking it reasonably with a high responsibility to help these people achieve greater learning outcomes and therefore have greater prospects for their work life. Now, let's get to cities. Why are they overheating? The IPCC, in their latest sermon that they released in 2021, for the first time, have created a separate section for urban areas. That was the first time in recognition to the importance of cities to climate change effects on a larger scale. As stated in their regional fact sheet for cities, urbanization has exacerbated changes in temperature extremes in cities, in particular for nighttime extremes. And we can see that in Western Sydney, where we have sometimes nighttime temperatures above 35 degrees, above 30 degrees, which is very, very stressful on the human body. The urban heat island effect is further amplified in cities that lack vegetation and water bodies. So these two impacts really summarize why our cities are overheating. And to further picture what it means for cities and development, there's a very nice graphic in this fact sheet where you can see that the geometry and human activities and heat retaining properties are highlighted as those elements in cities that contribute to warming. The statement at the end said that cities are lacking blue and green infrastructure, which is of course our cooling infrastructure. And this image shows you that water and vegetation are the only elements really that can cool at a whole of city or metropolitan scale. It is very interesting to also look at the shaded or the dashed areas that are extending those bars. You can see that for vegetation, there's the longest indication of variation. So up to 3 degrees cooling you could get from vegetation. There are things like irrigation, and we will talk about that today, that can enhance the cooling you get from your vegetation. There are other aspects where, for example, you not irrigate and you have the wrong species, where warming starts to take place more and therefore the cooling capacity of vegetation is reduced. We will talk about that as well, particularly when we get to trees and the age of trees, young trees versus old trees. I want to highlight the urban heat and with it the urban heat island effect. This is an example of Paris. So what you see in these images is Paris out of the sky, satellite imagery. We're looking at a day in summer for 4-hour increments, and it starts at 1 to 4 o'clock in the night and then goes from top left to the top right and then starts in the second row. You can see that the first 2 graphs in the top row are still during the night, a very pronounced urban heat island effect. The urban core of Paris is much, much warmer than the surrounding mostly vegetated area. There's quite a bit of forest around Paris as well. As the sun goes up, you look at the very right, 9 to 12, and then at the bottom left, 12 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it becomes very heterogeneous. So the urban heat island effect starts to wash out because of the different material thermal properties of materials within the city that you have throughout the landscape, which means heat is not only staying in the city, but also can be quite warm around the city. When you have, for example, a field that was just recently plowed and you have bare earth exposed to direct sunshine, it becomes really warm. So surface temperatures can also rise in the surrounding area. But when you look at the scale on the right side of each graph, you can see that during the night, our scale runs from 14 to 24 degrees, or from 13 to 23 in the very early morning hours. When you look at the afternoon, bottom left, that's from 30 to 40 degrees. So we're of course seeing much greater heat loads, but more distributed in a heterogeneous way. Lots of people think the urban heat island effect just happens all the time. It's most pronounced during the night, and that's why it's so important that the IPCC has stated that particularly hot nights are on the increase, with a very high expectancy for more hot nights. And this is where the urban heat island effect kicks in and causes us a lot of problems related to public health. When we think about what happens in cities, I think this image explains it very clearly, because what we do is we change land use from vegetated open surfaces to closed surfaces, anything that you can think of, from streets to driveways, walkways, houses, that lead to heat. Simple as that. The problem is that we're changing the thermal capacity of a landscape. On the one side here in the right, you see vegetation cover compared to a master planned community in Western Sydney. The vegetation not only transpires and therefore provides air cooling, it also has a relatively low thermal mass. That means it exchanges heat very quickly, and because it transpires, it has water available, it stays cool. Surface temperatures are much, much lower. Once you start introducing hard materials from roads to buildings, you can see how surface temperatures increase tremendously. And that, of course, warms the air. And that means not only is your house warm, but also your neighborhood is warm. And that's where, at this scale, we need to start think of how can we change this warming to either reducing this warming or even eliminating it completely. One of the really big culprits in my work that I find time and time again are unshaded car parks, covered by bitumen without any shade. As you can see here, this is the new Sydney Zoo near the Lighthorse interchange at Eastern Creek. It is a micro-urban heat island in itself. And of course, my measurements show that the nighttime temperatures around this car park are higher compared to the nearby Eastern Creek nature areas. That, of course, has effects on ecological food chains, on habitat quality, and so on. And this is a continuous problem that we see across all of Western Sydney, where we found that we have about 6 square kilometers of unshaded black car parks. 6 square kilometers. Think about how many football stadiums without anything else that is just black, soaking up the energy from the sun and re-radiating that into the night. I don't go too deep here, but just as an indicator for what really happens from the physical side with those kind of surfaces, and the same would apply to streets, the same would apply to buildings. You're dealing with incoming shortwave and longwave radiation that gets absorbed by surfaces and gets stored. It depends on if you are during the day or during the night looking at these energy equations. Energy has to go somewhere. In the case of those hard surfaces, the energy from the sun is transferred into energy you can feel, the sensible heat flux. So if you walk over a hard surface that had a lot of exposure of sunshine during the day, you will feel radiant heat coming off that makes you feel warmer. You can feel that on your skin. So this is basically captured in this diagram that shows you the heat fluxes and energy fluxes that lead to warming the atmosphere above those surfaces. So now how can we change these heat characteristics of materials, of places? Of course we can do what I call e-cooling, electricity. Just use electricity to cool things down. We can cool indoor spaces. So there are lots of applications, and we saw it recently in these tremendous super heat dome effects in North America and southern Canada, where we had suddenly cooling centers popping up everywhere because people were not equipped at home with air conditioning. You can see in the top left, there's a building retrofitted with air conditioning after air conditioning system after air conditioning system. This is what happens at the moment in Southeast Asia. Of course, that in itself has a lot of climate implications in the long run. At the left bottom, you can see one of those cooling centers, and we trailed one in Blacktown so far. But if we ever experience similar conditions like those in Northern America and Southern Canada, we don't have this kind of infrastructure in Sydney. So what do? Where do the people go that don't have air conditioning at home? Or what happens when we have blackouts because of the electricity grid being at capacity and pushed beyond because everyone switches their air conditioning systems on? There are solutions. This was a recent picture given to me by a friend who visited the Australian Open, where you had misting. It's hard to see. Misting apparatuses where people can actually get cooled in the summer heat. In the bottom, in the middle, you can see outdoor cooling in a mall in the United Arab Emirates. Something that I think is in the end, I can't find any better word than perverse, because it's bizarre that you try with these kind of air conditioning systems cool the outdoor space, which lasts a second. So you have to keep them running all the time to make it a little bit more enjoyable to sit outside. But that's what we see happening. And then, of course, there are these really bizarre solutions. Some of them come from military, where you have personal wearables that cool you down, and then they're even making air conditioning systems for dog homes now. So it's really, yes, e-cooling is one way to go. I think it's not the right way. This is much more what we want. We want climate sensitive cooling. And you can see in this little animation, it's green facades, it's pocket parks, it's taking away streets, or even if you leave streets there for active transport, you put some cool paving out so that you have reflective surfaces that stay cooler. There are lots of things that we can do. Of course, this is wishful thinking because it doesn't happen as quick as we see here, but I think that is much more reasonable to approach our cities in a way where we take climate sensitivity into account and try to use green infrastructure and blue infrastructure to cool them down. Well, if we want to have green infrastructure, then we have a problem because, and this is signified here in the left-hand side, trees grow slow. If we plant trees today, they probably give us some kind of cooling in 20 years that is meaningful, but we will have hot summers in between. What do we do? Also, the graph on the left-hand side shows you that trees, even if you plant the same species, will grow different in different places. So in some places, they may grow slower than in others. We find places in Sydney where we can't even grow trees because you have all the underground services or you have the overhead power lines. How do you grow a tree there with meaningful canopy over time? And then this is on the right-hand side in that graph. Then we have a problem about over-promising and under-delivering when we get to tree cooling. When we empirically measure how much tree canopy cover gives us how much cooling, we can see in the bottom two lines that we get maybe 1 or 0.1 degree per 10% canopy increase, maybe up to 1/4 of a degree for 10% canopy increase. By the way, Sydney is aiming for 40% canopy cover. So there are limits, and we can't just promise, hey, we make the city green and then everything is cool. That's not the case. When we use models, there's this problem of over-promising depending on the input parameters into your models, where you can see if we use NVMet, a widely used urban climate model, you get 1.4 degrees per 10% increase in canopy cover. Very unrealistic. We've never ever measured that in the real world. So there are problems, of course, when people start to use NVMet and set up policies around what we want to achieve and say, hey, we get 3-degree cooling by increasing canopy cover by 20%. Let's do that. We doubt that this will actually happen. What we do instead is we provide alternatives. And this is part of the research I'm doing here in Western Sydney and also in Eastern Sydney, where we look at other alternatives and we provide recommendations from playgrounds to schools to light rail transport. A few of those reports are out there. Feel free to take them with you to have a look how we are communicating our research. We always put actions, recommendations, cheat sheets or crib sheets in there. So if you're a busy policymaker or a director of a program, you don't need to read the 60-page report. Go to the crib sheet or the cheat sheet at the beginning, get the key points, and then inform your co-workers about the really important changes that need to start happen. We're trying to to bypass these long processes by going out, doing the empirical research, and then providing these recommendations that are realistic and so can be implemented. This was in one of the reports, a very interesting image about roof color. And probably a few of you out there in the Zoom world have heard me talking about black roofs and how much I despise them because they're really, really unnecessary. Now, this image shows you why I do this. You can see the black roofs in the foreground on the left are the hottest temperatures, have the hottest surface temperatures. Once you look further back into this little street block, there are some beige and white colored roofs. They are about half of the temperature, which also means the surface heat from those roofs will not radiate into your house, will not increase your air conditioning needs. You will have a cooler home. And collectively, of course, and this is also work done by UNSW, collectively, you can reduce neighborhood and even whole city temperature if you start to collectively have reflective roofs. So it's not just your own home that you're impacting, it's the entire city that you're impacting because your city is made up of many individual homes. So if we change those, we change the city. Of course, there's a problem if someone that decides which kind of policies are put forward in this state that we should not ban black roofs, then we're back to the situation where we were 5 years ago, where we started with this research telling people that it makes your house hotter. And if you build a home, you need a roof anyway. Why not put a beige one on? In some councils, you're not even allowed to do that. So for example, the Northern Beaches wants to have your building to blend into the bushland character of the council. You're not allowed to have a beige roof. To me, that makes very little sense. From a design perspective and aesthetics perspective, maybe it makes sense, and that's probably where the decision came from. But when we want to achieve citywide cooling and reduce heat across our city, we need to get into these kind of design applications that we can change. Here's another one. Similar situation, it's a master plan community. You can see the original view and then the infrared view. And I just want to point out this building here, the second from the right, has AstroTurf, synthetic turf in the front garden, has replaced the natural turf with this material. And you can see how much hotter it is. It gets into these reds and even the whites, which is about 60, 65 degrees. And this is a 25-degree air temperature where I was out there. Very, very hot material. Makes no sense because as you see here in the image, the highest heat load of that material is right at the house. That means the front of the house gets nice and warm just because of this material. You can also see that the driveways painted in different shades of gray and even black have much higher temperatures than the very left one, which is left natural in this very light concrete color. It's very fashionable and I don't understand why. It matches probably the black roof nicely, right? It's very fashionable to paint your driveways in dark colors, which again increases the heat load in front of your home. And then you can also see the selection of garage door color, again, brings heat into your house or leaves heat outside the house. And these are simple design choices when you assemble your new home. You can just say, hey, I want a white colored garage door. It doesn't cost you anything more or less than the brown one, but it will cost you less in electricity use for air conditioning in summer. We also went to playgrounds. By the way, how am I doing with time? 35? That's good. Yep. We looked at playgrounds for several reasons. This one is in Western Sydney, not far from where I'm speaking, in Maryland. Playgrounds are very important places for children that grow up in cities. It's probably the only area where they have access to nature. If they live in high density settings where you have no more gardens, and maybe even you live in an apartment where you have a balcony. So playgrounds become really important. Public parks become really important. They allow gross motor activity. You learn risk management with your body. You socialize. You develop physical and cognitive capacities while you're playing. Now, if, as in the top of this picture, if you're playing in a playground where there's no shade and you have a very hot surface material, you cannot play there in summer. It's not safe. Plus, you're exposed to the UV. And we know if children are exposed to high UV in their early childhood years, they have a much higher chance to develop skin cancer later on in life. So there are lots of reasons why we should have high quality shade in playgrounds. And here we demonstrated that you can even go further. So this structure that you see donated from industry partners that worked with us, the structure tests different types of shade. It also allows, with these open spaces, the hot air to vent through the structure. The structure itself is made in a modular way. So once and you can see it in the background, we've got plants, trees that we planted. So we are trying to grow natural shade on the northern and the western side of the playground. When the trees are big enough, we can take the shade structure and go to the next playground. So some kind of idea of sustainable use of materials for these kind of projects where the steel structure can just be readjusted for the next playground. It was a very successful project. I've been there not too long ago, around Christmas. We did some filming there. It was packed all the time. People love it. They absolutely took it on. And I talked to people there. They do remember how it was before, when they, over the Christmas, New Year's break and into the school holidays, they couldn't go there during the day because it was just too hot. And now they're just having a new playground that they can actually use. We did paint asphalt surfaces, 45,000 square meters of it in Campbelltown, Blacktown, and in Parramatta, and assessed how these reflectant seal coats can help keep streets cooler. We found that the hotter it gets, the hotter the surface temperature, the greater the cooling effect. We measured up to 13 degrees when the surface was nearly 80 degrees when it wasn't painted. So that is your reduction that you see in the dotted line. We have the one-to-one relationship. If you deviate from that towards the lower end of the x-axis, then you're cooling your surface. And so the red line is our cooling on those painted surfaces. You can see at 20 degrees, you don't get much. But if you get into the 60s and 70s and higher 70s, then you are significantly cooling this surface. That's a great outcome. So if we want to have surface cooling, then we have a technique that we can apply. This is a big project. Feel free to just use the QR code to get to our website. That's what we're currently doing at Bicentennial Park, changing the whole park into a natural air conditioning system, where we provide the coolest possible conditions inside the park and also around the park by changing the irrigation system from human operations into AI. And the AI is helping us to condition the entire park. It's about 200 different zones that we have, condition the entire park to have optimal hydration status, which means all plants can transpire freely at maximum rates when it's hot, instead of shutting down and preserving water. So that means we get the highest air cooling out of the park. It's a very, very nice project, and we're really proud of what we're achieving here. It will run a few more months, and then hopefully for the next 5 years, Sydney Olympic Park Authority, together with some subcontractors, are continuing the operation of the system. So it's embedded into the urban fabric for the people of Sydney Olympic Park to enjoy. You can go online and check right now where the coolest and where the hottest spot is in the park. All that data is live streaming. It's a very exciting project. You may have also seen things like this popping up in your neighborhood when you look around. The one on the left is my neighborhood where I live, where suddenly they closed the street off and they started to build water-sensitive urban design elements into this street, which just collects the runoff and directs it now into this little pit where you have plants that are growing. You have also other examples where passive irrigation opens up the curb and allows stormwater to flow into tree pits to actually help the trees to grow faster because they have more water available. that helps with particularly with newly planted trees, where often you don't have the capacity in your local governments to run around with a water tanker and put water out all the time. Here you can actually rely on stormwater infiltration. And I want to, of course, acknowledge that also my colleagues are doing really great work. It's not just me, but there are quite a few people out there. This is happening at a global scale. There are reports here from the World Bank and from the United Nations Environment Program. There are also documents up here from colleagues in universities. UNSW is very strong also here in Sydney. And very, very good work is done from the Western Sydney Regional Organization of Councils. They're doing absolutely groundbreaking work in urban cooling and how we can get to cooler suburbs. So what can we do today? I will run through this quickly. I come back to Paris because I showed you the urban heat island map for Paris. Paris has done something that is absolutely mind-boggling. It's probably the largest urban cooling system in the world. Currently, they have about 90 kilometers of underground pipes where they use the water from the Seine to have heat exchange that the water takes up from air that is pushed through that system. And then the warmed water is put back into the Seine. So that helps them save many, many hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 emissions because they don't need to run air conditioning systems. And just think of a picture of Paris. There are lots and lots of heritage buildings. You can't put air conditioning on these buildings like I showed you from Southeast Asia. It's just illegal. You can't do it. Also, the structure may not actually carry the air conditioning system. So they needed to come up with something else. In the early 90s, they started to develop this system and are now expanding it. By 2040, they want to have more than 1,000 buildings that are cooled by this system. But they didn't stop there. Together with various local government organizations, they developed what is called the Extrema app, where you can just find a cool place within wherever you are. Within 7 minutes, you can find a cool place in Paris when it's hot in summer. They open up their fountains. You can take a dip in the fountains. They become islands of freshness. There's a program, Île de Fraîcheur. There are misting system in public places. So all of this is done. Interestingly, also the city of Sydney joined Resilient Cities. It's a global program by the Rockefeller Foundation. Sydney does great work in this space, but Paris has gone much further since they joined this global program. There are cool rooms everywhere. They have increased the coverage of green roofs, and the programs around demineralization are really interesting, where they practically rip up the surface that is impervious and put back pervious surface for rainwater to be absorbed, which of course again helps to hydrate plants. It helps to reduce stormwater runoff and so on and so forth. So they're doing a lot. There are some really great things happening in Paris. We have examples here from Germany, how you can build a cool suburb. That's 20 years ago. And triple glazing and solar was compulsory there. That's 20 years ago. When you want to have your home approved, and you use basics to get the DA's approval from council, you still get away with single glazing here in Sydney today. It makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense. And the cost from single to double glazing is not that big. We try. This is Fairwater in Blacktown, one of the settlements that I know or learned about now, where some very interesting concepts were implemented and trialed. Fraser Property has developed this settlement for more than 1,000 residents. They are hooked up to a geothermal cooling system, so they're not using electricity for air cooling as we would normally do with a recycling aircon. They have parklands. You can see that in this settlement, the mature trees were incorporated into the landscaping. They created new wetlands. They combined blue and green infrastructure. They say that the 80% of the people living there are now more happy and satisfied with how they live than where they lived before. So it has an impact on the quality of life of the people there. There's community, people are outdoors. It seems to be a very nice place. It's a good example of where in Sydney we actually do something well. We could do better with rooftops. There are extensive and intensive rooftop gardens, some great solutions where you can add additional green space into the city without ripping up surface at the ground. You just take greening up It also helps biodiversity. If you're not going onto skyscrapers, of course, you don't have insects up there anymore. But if you're working at multi-story apartment buildings, then yes, there are some great studies that look at beetles, look at birds, look at all sorts of things. You also create space for urban agriculture. So there are lots of opportunities for rooftop gardens that we can develop. I love this picture. It's just imagine on a hot summer day, you walk through this part of the street. There's water trickling, so you get this kind of sound of cooling. There's shade. You still have sunlight dappling through. You probably hear the rustling of the leaves. It just makes you feel much more relaxed. And I think it's very beautiful too. And it's very, very functional. You get cooling from blue and you get cooling from the leaves, from the trees. Why don't we build more like this in our city? I don't know any example like this from Sydney. It's very sad. And of course, green car parks. And I don't mean these green car parks. I mean these green car parks. So green car parks, huge opportunity where we know we have, at least in Western Sydney, 6 square kilometers of unshaded car parks. In some places, we may not be able to put trees in, but for example, at Bangarra in the Western Sydney parklands, they used locally sourced sandstone, crushed it up and used that as an open surface material to cover the parking bays where you don't have a lot of steering and wheel action and acceleration and so on. It's fine. The material is still there after many years. It's not that it's everywhere and you know, you lost it because it wasn't a concrete or an asphalt surface. There are other products that are available. EcoGrid, for example, which is a plastic grid in which you have the load distribution from your vehicle, but you have space where you can grow grass. So it becomes a green surface that you can actually drive on without damaging the grass. It works. The car park is in use. We have similar installations at Sydney Olympic Park, but they're only for overflow car parks, not for the car parks where you have most of the traffic coming in. We also developed for everyone out there available now a handbook together with Standard Australia, industry partners, landscape architects, and also some researchers like myself worked on this handbook. Took us about 3 years. It's out there now, was published in January, where we provide planning and decision-making frameworks of how you integrate green infrastructure into cities, either in greenfield developments or in densification projects, public, private, large scale, small scale. It's out there for everyone in Australia to use. It has a glossary, so we can talk actually about the same kind of elements when we talk about greening in the city. So again, it's a resource that we're developing so that we can push in the right direction. In summary, anyone out there, please accept the scientific findings and start acting on them. It's heartbreaking to see such simple things as replacing black roofs with beige roofs has still so much resistance within various types of communities, be it developers or be it politicians. It's just heartbreaking because it means we're not progressing towards urban cooling. I have shown in this presentation that urban cooling is available and how blue and green infrastructure should be really integrated because it gives us the greatest cooling benefits. Be everywhere means work at playgrounds, schools, car parks, streets, anywhere. Cooling needs to happen everywhere and anywhere. I say embrace density and retain open space. Stop building flat and white like we do now. Build up, and the space that you're saving, do not cover it with more hard infrastructure. Leave it open for parklands for people to enjoy so they can actually have a quality of life when they live in these higher apartment blocks or even skyscrapers. Demineralize, that's a fantastic term. Take it away and put it into your workplace. Rip up hard surfaces and replace them with open surfaces wherever you can. It makes a huge difference. If we have water seeping into the ground, particularly in those new developments where we're just covering, it's called capping. We're soil capping large areas that generate so much runoff, which then causes lots of problems downstream in our waterways. And of course, we're here to work with you once you didn't forget to not just reduce and mitigate, but also adapt. And we're happy to test those mechanisms with you. I can't do this work by myself. These are partners that we work with in urban cooling in various projects. It's very important for us at Western Sydney University to look into partnerships and then building and retaining partnerships, continuing these partnerships, because we can't do the work ourselves. We need partnerships. As you can see, it's universities, government organizations, industry. We all work together into the direction that are outlined in this talk. And I leave you with a last image before I'm happy to take some questions and comments, where I want to point out, if you're interested in learning more about urban cooling, there will be probably in about a few weeks a new course in OpenLearning, which is done by Western Sydney University's online learning platform, which is called The Basics of Urban Cooling, where I explain more around urban cooling and also how to plan for cooler cities. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.